The story begins not with oil itself, but with what happens to a nation's economy the moment that first barrel rolls off the production line. Imagine you are running a small business in a country that has just discovered massive oil reserves. Perhaps you manufacture furniture, or you grow coffee, or you operate a textile factory. For years, you have been competing in international markets, selling your products abroad, employing local workers, developing expertise and efficiency. Your business is part of a diverse economic ecosystem that includes dozens of different industries, each contributing to employment, innovation, and economic resilience. Then the oil starts flowing, and everything changes in ways you cannot control and did not anticipate. The first change is the most immediate and the most deceptive. Money floods into your country, vast rivers of foreign currency as international oil companies and foreign governments pay for your nation's petroleum. This should be good news. And initially it feels like a miracle. The government suddenly has money to spend on infrastructure, on schools, on hospitals. Politicians promise a glorious future. But that flood of foreign currency does something strange to your economy. It makes your national currency more valuable compared to other currencies. This is simple supply and demand. When foreigners want to buy your oil, they need to buy your currency first to pay for it. This increased demand for your currency makes it stronger. The story begins not with oil itself, but with what happens to a nation's economy the moment that first barrel rolls off the production line. Imagine you are running a small business in a country that has just discovered massive oil reserves. Perhaps you manufacture furniture, or you grow coffee, or you operate a textile factory. For years, you have been competing in international markets, selling your products abroad, employing local workers, developing expertise and efficiency. Your business is part of a diverse economic ecosystem that includes dozens of different industries, each contributing to employment, innovation, and economic resilience. Then the oil starts flowing, and everything changes in ways you cannot control and did not anticipate. The first change is the most immediate and the most deceptive. Money floods into your country, vast rivers of foreign currency as international oil companies and foreign governments pay for your nation's petroleum. This should be good news, and initially, it feels like a miracle. The government suddenly has money to spend on infrastructure, on schools, on hospitals. Politicians promise a glorious future, but that flood of foreign currency does something strange to your economy. It makes your national currency more valuable compared to other currencies. This is simple supply and demand. When foreigners want to buy your oil, they need to buy your currency first to pay for it. This increased demand for your currency makes it stronger. Now here is where your furniture business starts to feel the pain. When your currency becomes stronger, your furniture suddenly becomes more expensive for foreign buyers. The American importer who used to buy your chairs for what seemed like a reasonable price now finds that those same chairs cost significantly more when converted from his dollars into your now stronger currency. Meanwhile, furniture makers in other countries without oil wealth and without strong currencies, can offer similar products at lower prices. You start losing orders, you lay off workers, you consider closing your factory, and you are not alone. The coffee growers cannot compete with Brazilian or Colombian coffee. The textile manufacturers cannot compete with Asian producers. One by one, the non-oil industries in your country begin to wither and die. And this phenomenon has a name that carries its own ironic history. Economists call it Dutch disease, named after what happened to the Netherlands in the 1960s when they discovered massive natural gas reserves in the North Sea. The Dutch, with their long history of trade and manufacturing, watched as their traditional industries became uncompetitive and collapsed. Their currency strengthened, their exports declined, and their economy became dangerously dependent on a single commodity. The Dutch, being Dutch, eventually figured out how to manage this problem through careful policy and the creation of sovereign wealth funds. Most oil-rich nations are not so fortunate. But the death of diverse industry is only the beginning of the curse. The real destruction comes from what oil wealth does to the political and social fabric of a nation. This is where the story becomes darker and more human, where we see how the curse operates not just through economic mechanisms, but through the transformation of human behavior and institutional structures. Let us follow this transformation in Venezuela, a nation that went from being the wealthiest in South America to a place where people search through garbage for food. In the 1970s, Venezuela was thriving. The capital of Caracas gleamed with new skyscrapers. The government subsidized everything from gasoline to food. Venezuelans traveled abroad for shopping trips to Miami, their strong currency making them the envy of the continent. The government, flush with oil revenue, did not need to tax its citizens heavily. This seemed like a blessing. Why would any citizen complain about low taxes and generous government services? But here is what nobody understood at the time. When a government does not need tax revenue from its citizens, it stops being accountable to them. The entire relationship between state and citizen inverts. In a normal democracy, governments must tax their citizens to function, and this creates a natural accountability mechanism. Citizens demand transparency, efficiency, and responsiveness because they are paying for government services with their own money. They vote out leaders who waste resources or become corrupt. The government, needing continued tax revenue, must maintain legitimacy in the eyes of its people. But an oil-rich government does not need its citizens' money. It has oil revenue. The citizens become irrelevant to the government's financial survival. The government's only constituency becomes whoever controls access to the oil revenue. This is usually a small elite of politicians, military officers, and connected businessmen. In Venezuela, this dynamic played out with devastating clarity. Hugo Chavez came to power promising to use oil wealth for the poor, and initially he delivered. Oil prices were high and there was money for everything. Massive social programs provided food, healthcare, and housing. But Chavez and his successors made a fatal choice that oil-rich leaders often make. They used the oil revenue not to build a diverse, productive economy, but to buy political loyalty and maintain power. They nationalized the oil industry and used it as a piggy bank for political spending. They did not invest in maintaining oil infrastructure, in developing other industries, or in building sovereign wealth funds for future generations. They spent everything, and when oil prices inevitably fell, the entire house of cards collapsed. The collapse was spectacular and tragic. By the 2010s, Venezuelan oil production had fallen dramatically, not because the oil was gone, but because the state oil company had become so corrupt and mismanaged that it could barely function. The government had printed money to cover its spending, causing hyperinflation that destroyed the currency. People could not afford basic food, hospitals ran out of medicine, millions fled the country. Venezuela, sitting on top of the world's largest proven oil reserves, became one of the poorest nations in the hemisphere. The oil that was supposed to be a blessing had become an instrument of destruction. Nigeria tells a similar story with different details. When oil was discovered in the Niger Delta in the 1950s, Nigeria was primarily agricultural, producing significant quantities of palm oil, cocoa, and peanuts for export. The country had diverse regional economies and a growing manufacturing sector. Then came oil, and the agricultural sector collapsed. Why grow cocoa when you could get a government job in the oil sector or in the bureaucracy that oil revenue supported? The answer seemed obvious at the time, but it destroyed the foundation of the economy. Nigerian oil wealth concentrated in the hands of a small elite, connected to the military and government. Corruption became systematic and overwhelming. Military coups became frequent as different factions fought for control of oil revenue. The Niger Delta, where the oil actually came from, saw almost none of the benefits. Instead, it suffered environmental devastation as oil spills poisoned the water and soil. Local communities, watching foreign companies and distant government officials get rich from oil taken from their land while they remained in poverty, organized militant groups. These groups began sabotaging oil infrastructure and kidnapping oil workers. This violence further reduced oil production and scared away investment, creating a vicious cycle of conflict and economic decline. The tragedy of Nigeria is that its population grew rapidly during the oil boom, but the economy did not create enough diverse jobs to employ all those people. Young Nigerians, many with university degrees, could not find work because the oil sector employed relatively few people and other industries had been allowed to die. The government, dependent on oil revenue, could not collect enough taxes to provide basic services. Infrastructure decayed. Schools failed. The gap between rich and poor became a chasm. Today, despite decades of oil production, the majority of Nigerians live in poverty. The oil wealth that should have built a modern economy instead financed corruption, fueled conflict, and destroyed economic diversity. Iraq presents yet another variation of the curse. Here, oil wealth combined with authoritarianism and regional conflict to create a perfect storm of dysfunction. Saddam Hussein used oil revenue to build a massive military and wage wars against Iran and Kuwait. These wars devastated the Iraqi economy and led to international sanctions that further isolated the country. When the American invasion toppled Hussein in 2003, there was hope that Iraq could finally use its massive oil reserves to rebuild. Instead, the country descended into sectarian violence and insurgency. The oil infrastructure became a target for militants. Corruption became endemic as different factions fought over control of oil revenue. Various governments tried to rebuild, but each struggled with the same fundamental problem. Oil revenue flowed to those who controlled the government, creating intense competition for political power and incentivizing violence rather than governance. The curse continued under new management. Even countries that avoided complete collapse often find themselves trapped in a peculiar kind of stagnation. Saudi Arabia, with the world's second largest oil reserves, has maintained stability through a combination of authoritarian control and massive government spending. The government provides jobs, free education, free healthcare, and subsidizes nearly everything else. But this has created an economy where the private sector is weak, where citizens expect government jobs rather than creating their own businesses, where entrepreneurship and innovation lag behind much poorer nations. The Saudi leadership recognizes this problem, which is why they have spent the last decade trying to diversify their economy. But diversification is harder than it sounds when oil still provides the vast majority of government revenue and when the entire social contract is built around distributing oil wealth. The question that haunts all these stories is why countries do not simply avoid these mistakes. The mechanisms of the curse are well understood by economists. The examples of failure are numerous and well documented. Why do oil-rich nations keep falling into the same trap? The answer lies in the political economy of resource wealth, in the way oil money warps incentives and corrupts institutions in ways that are very difficult to resist. When oil revenue starts flowing into government coffers, the incentives facing political leaders change fundamentally. In a normal economy, a leader who wants to stay in power must help the economy grow, must ensure that citizens have jobs and opportunities, must invest in infrastructure and education that will pay dividends over decades. This is hard work that requires vision, competence, and patience. But for a leader sitting on oil wealth, there is a much easier path to maintaining power. Use the oil money to buy loyalty, give government jobs to supporters, provide subsidies and handouts, enrich key political and military allies. This strategy works, at least in the short term, and requires much less competence than actually building a functional economy. The problem is that this strategy destroys the very institutions that a country needs for long-term prosperity. When the path to wealth runs through political connections rather than productive work, the best and brightest do not become entrepreneurs or engineers or teachers. They become politicians or fixers or middlemen. The economy becomes a zero-sum game where the goal is to capture a share of the oil rent rather than to create new value. Corruption becomes not just common but rational. Why follow the rules when everyone who gets ahead does so by bending them? The entire social fabric begins to rot. This institutional decay is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the oil curse because it is so difficult to reverse. Building effective institutions, establishing rule of law, creating a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation takes generations. Destroying those things with oil money can happen in a decade. Countries that discover oil after they have already built strong institutions have a fighting chance. Norway discovered oil after it had already become a wealthy, well-governed democracy with strong institutions and a culture of transparency. The Norwegians were able to manage their oil wealth effectively, creating a massive sovereign wealth fund that now holds over $1 trillion and ensuring that oil revenue enhanced rather than replaced their diverse economy. But Norway is the exception, not the rule. Most oil-rich nations discovered their petroleum wealth before they had built the institutions necessary to manage it wisely. There is also a timing problem that makes the curse particularly cruel. Countries often discover oil when they are poor and desperate for development. The temptation to spend the oil revenue immediately rather than saving it for the future is overwhelming. Politicians face pressure to show results, to improve lives today, to demonstrate that the oil wealth is benefiting ordinary citizens. Saving money for future generations seems wasteful when people are hungry now, when schools lack books, when hospitals lack medicine. So governments spend, and in spending, they set in motion all the destructive dynamics of the curse. The global oil market itself amplifies these problems. Oil prices are notoriously volatile, swinging wildly based on global supply and demand, geopolitical events, and speculation. When prices are high, oil-rich governments spend freely, often borrowing against future oil revenue to spend even more. They make commitments to social programs, to government employment, to subsidies that they cannot easily reverse. Then, when prices crash, as they inevitably do, governments face impossible choices. Cut spending and face social unrest, print money and cause inflation, borrow more and accumulate unsustainable debt. There are no good options, and the cycle of boom and bust leaves these economies increasingly fragile and dysfunctional. The environmental dimension of the oil curse adds another layer of tragedy. Oil extraction often devastates local environments, polluting water, destroying ecosystems, and making traditional livelihoods like farming and fishing impossible. The communities that suffer this environmental damage rarely see benefits from the oil wealth, which flows to distant capitals and foreign bank accounts. This creates resentment and conflict, further destabilizing oil-rich regions. In places like the Niger Delta or the Amazon basin, the environmental and social costs of oil extraction have created humanitarian disasters that governments focused on maximizing oil revenue largely ignore. Climate change introduces a final existential element to the oil curse. As the world transitions away from fossil fuels, oil-rich nations face the prospect that their greatest asset will become worthless. Countries that allowed oil wealth to destroy their economic diversity now face a future where they will have neither oil revenue nor alternative industries. Venezuela provides a glimpse of this future. With production collapsed and the world moving away from oil, Venezuelan petroleum may never again generate the wealth it once did. The country must somehow build a new economy from the ruins of the old, but decades of corruption and institutional decay have left it ill-equipped for this challenge. Yet even as we document this parade of failures, new oil discoveries continue to trigger the same old dreams. When Guyana discovered massive offshore oil reserves in recent years, there was jubilation. Finally, this poor South American nation would have the resources to develop. But economists and historians watching from the outside felt a familiar sense of dread. Would Guyana manage its oil wealth wisely, or would it follow the well-worn path to dysfunction and disappointment? The early signs are not encouraging. Corruption scandals have already emerged. Government spending is rising rapidly. The political competition for control of oil revenue is intensifying. The curse is taking hold. The story of oil and economic destruction is ultimately a story about human nature and institutional failure. It is a story about how sudden wealth can corrupt rather than empower, how abundance can breed dysfunction rather than prosperity. The geologist standing in the Venezuelan sun, watching oil shoot into the air, could not have known that he was witnessing the beginning of a curse. But we know now. We have seen this story play out dozens of times across multiple continents and generations. We understand the mechanisms, we can predict the outcomes, and yet the cycle continues. Breaking the curse requires more than just technical economic policy. It requires building and maintaining institutions that can resist the corrupting influence of oil wealth. It requires political leaders willing to prioritize long-term prosperity over short-term political advantage. It requires citizens who demand accountability and transparency even when times are good. It requires the discipline to save when spending seems more attractive, to diversify when oil seems sufficient, to invest in education and infrastructure rather than handouts and subsidies. These are hard things, perhaps impossible things for many nations, especially those without a history of strong institutions and good governance. The curse beneath the sand continues to claim victims because the temptations it offers are immediate and concrete, while the dangers it poses seem distant and abstract. Every nation that discovers oil believes it will be different, that it will avoid the mistakes of others, that its oil wealth will be a blessing rather than a curse. And every nation learns, usually too late, that oil wealth without wisdom is not wealth at all. It is a burden that can break a nation, that can transform promise into poverty, that can make people wish the oil had never been found. The black gold erupting from the earth is not a miracle. For most nations that find it, it is a poison that slowly destroys everything it touches. This is the paradox that defines our age of oil, the substance that powered the modern world, that enabled unprecedented prosperity and development, has proven catastrophic for the nations that produce it. The wealth that should have built hospitals and schools instead built corruption and conflict. The resource that should have secured the future instead destroyed it. And as the world moves beyond oil, these nations are left with nothing but the ruins of economies that oil wealth built and then demolished. They are left to wonder what might have been if the geologists had found nothing, if the black gold had stayed buried, if they had been forced to build their prosperity on harder but more sustainable foundations. But the oil was found, the money flowed, and the curse did its work. Now they must live with the consequences.